The Next Generation NYCHA plan, released last May, is comprehensive, too sweeping really to describe in one evening. 10-year pictures, a picture of the authority's plan to work its way out of the hole it's in. This doesn't mean we're going to be happy with it all or that it's all going to work. It's a wide-ranging plan, but what I'd like to focus on this evening are the housing transformations that it envisions. I'd like to focus on what will happen to the housing. And that falls into two categories. There's an affordable housing development program, which I'll, for the sake of brevity, I'll call the Infill program. And that's a program to use available NYCHA land for private residential construction on site. And that is the major revenue generator in the NYCHA plan. That's what NYCHA has the most control over, its real estate assets, and it sees that as a major component of its revenue gaining strategy. The second transformation has to do with the planned transfer of some existing NYCHA developments, those that are most costly to continue to manage and repair, to transfer them into alternative ownership and be sustained under alternative hands, private hands, as affordable housing. That we can call the strategy to stem the losses, stem the loss leaders in the inventory. And those developments will be leaving the public housing inventory. In that sense, they will be leaving the public housing sector and go into what we call the private assisted housing sector. Let's start by talking about the infill program a bit, what's planned. The infill component will generate revenue from two sources for NYCHA. This is to the capital it needs to catch up with its major infrastructural improvements. There'll be revenue from long-term land leases and revenue from NYCHA's share in the developer's fees when a developer comes in and builds on NYCHA land. Those can be considerable. A total of 17,500 infill apartments are planned for NYCHA communities over the next 10 years, making NYCHA, by the way, that's about a sixth of the 80,000 new affordable units that the mayor promised in his New York City housing plan. So that makes NYCHA a major partner in the process. The authority estimates that 50 to 60 out of the 334 developments will be involved in the infill process. That's quite a few. Of the 17,500 units to be developed, about 10,000 apartments will be in 100% affordable buildings. Now, we always have to ask the question, what do we mean by affordable? And the prevailing standard is what's called 60% of the AMI. On the average, it will be targeted to a family of three earning about $46,000 a year. And that's high for what CSS considers low income, and it's high for most NYCHA residents. The remaining 7,500 apartments will be in mixed income buildings where there will be 50% affordable and 50% market rentals. They will no doubt be located, as you can guess, in the stronger rental markets. But in total, if you look at the overall NYCHA infill plan, 80% of the apartments built on NYCHA sites will be affordable by that definition of affordability, which is a complete reversal of the Bloomberg recipe for infill, which was 80-20, 80 market rentals, 20% affordability. Some of the major questions that arise, you're probably already asking them. First is sort of the specter of the neoliberal model, in which means using the partial or full privatization of public resources to generate the capital needed to preserve them. Some of this is happening in where the proposal is to use air rights over post office buildings, over libraries, in order to provide them with the budget they need to go on operating. The question there is, does this kind of effort to draw in private capital, does it rationalize, enable, and accelerate government or public disinvestment? The more the private sector steps in, presumably with incentives to preserve this housing stock, to what extent does that discourage further public investment over the future and lead to more and more privatization? Second question is income targeting. We already saw that the average affordable incomes are relatively high for New York, and given the scarcity of land available for affordable development in the city, shouldn't low-cost or no-cost NYCHA land be reserved exclusively to house low-income New Yorkers, those with the greatest housing needs? So we have to ask, will there be subsidies available to make infill apartments accessible to low-income New Yorkers, to NYCHA residents who want to move into them, and to the homeless? Should there be set-asides for these groups in any of the infill housing developed? Third question, should the capital generated by infill redevelopment be primarily invested on-site in capital improvements for that development, or should it be used for capital improvements across other developments? The problem there is whether infill ends up gilding some developments while other communities continue to deteriorate. Fourth, what are the questions raised, particularly by residents? What are the consequences of introducing high-end market rentals in the midst of public housing communities? Will the community benefit? Are there long-term gentrification costs, displacement pressures, and the like? Like it or not, the infill process is already underway. It began in early 2014 under the de Blasio administration with community visioning exercises at 3 NYCHA developments: Millbrook houses in the Bronx, South Bronx, Ingersoll and Van Dyke houses in Brooklyn. Those were targeted, all 3 of them, for 100% affordable housing. Requests for proposals were issued last summer, bidder conferences were mobbed, and responses have just been submitted by the end of September. And NYCHA recently announced its first 2 50-50 affordable sites. Next week it will start visioning sessions with residents at Wyckoff Gardens in Boerum Hill, Brooklyn, and at Holmes Towers on the Upper East Side. Resistance seems to be mounting at Holmes. Maybe Mo can talk about that later. And the situation is still unclear at Wyckoff. Now, the second transformation that is stemming the loss leaders in the NYCHA inventory, let's take a look at that. About 15,000 units will be slated for transfer to in alternative ownership as affordable housing over the next 10 years. I'm not sure how many developments are involved, but roughly a 1/12 of NYCHA's apartments could be lost to the public housing inventory, even though presumably they will be preserved as affordable housing under other ownership. The scattered site developments comprise 6,400 units Those are largely low-rise tenement buildings that fell into NYCHA hands during the abandonment wave of the 1970s, when NYCHA was a relatively fat cat in the city and could take it on. Because of the individual variations in the scattered site developments, they are very expensive to manage and to repair compared to the standardized towers in the park developments that we all image public housing as, where if a door hinge was needed to be replaced, it didn't matter what development you were in, the door hinge fit no matter what. The NYCHA plan calls for transferring the scattered site developments to nonprofit ownership as ongoing affordable housing, but they will leave the public housing inventory. Another 8,300 units in the conventional towers in the park developments are also targeted for ownership transfer. They are considered obsolete, quotation marks, under HUD's definition, which means they would cost more to rehab than to construct them new, which is a possible trigger for HUD funding. Apart from the thrust toward privatization, the shift in ownership out of the hands of the authority into other hands, the central question is, where are the resources to facilitate all of these transfers? They have to be done. The properties have to be improved if they're put under alternative ownership. Where are the resources going to come from? We are told NYCHA is in discussion with HUD about a major preservation strategy. Given the huge size of the program, its importance in New York's affordable housing infrastructure, it can be argued that special consideration is needed to New York's exceptional public housing program. Potential resources could come from RAD. How many of you have heard of RAD? That's the HUD Rental Assistance Demonstration. Sam urges us to define all acronyms. And that's a program very generally that replaces public housing subsidies with long-term rent assistance contracts that go for a period of 20 to 30 years. They will usually require transfer to some form of alternative or private ownership, but those long-term guarantees of rent streams mean that the new owner can draw on private capital because it has the capacity to repay, and therefore can raise the capital needed to improve those developments. Right now, there is one RAD program in process that's in Far Rockaway at Ocean Bayside, 1,900 units, and the RAD there we're told, was made possible because that development also got a FEMA grant because it was affected by Superstorm Sandy. Over the future, I think NYCHA hopes to get some sort of hybrid special RAD program from HUD, and we'll be no doubt hearing more about it. RAD is already subsuming a substantial portion of the public housing in cities like Baltimore and San Francisco. In New York, there's just one development that's up for RAB so far. To NYCHA's credit, none of the Next Generation plan envisions demolition. And as you know, compared to other large cities where there has been massive demolition and conversion, like Chicago, Atlanta, Newark, NYCHA seems to be committed to preserving every unit of its existing stock as affordable housing. If not under NYCHA, then in alternative hands. But residents in scattered site developments and those that are assessed as obsolete should be made aware of the implications of the plan. I'm not sure that many of them know what the plan spells out for them. And we, those of us at the table here and me, have requested a list of those developments from NYCHA, but it isn't yet forthcoming. The ultimate question is whether or not we should support the NYCHA plan or oppose it or just bear witness. Particularly the envisioned, whatever you think about infill and the positions on that are very divergent. Whatever you think about alternative ownership plans and so on, that are being used in the plan to preserve public housing for the next generation. The question is, the bottom line question is, where will the capital come from to do all this? Not from Washington. We all know that. Pressure will have to continue to be put on the city and state for capital budget commitments, which is what we're doing. That would require the mayors and the if the city and state continue to provide $100 million a year, that's about $2 billion over 10 years. We can expect from Washington over the next 10 years a $250 million, 260 million times 10, that would be 2.6 million, another 2.6 million. Comptroller Scott Stringer has proposed dedicating batteries, excess revenues from Battery Park City to NYCHA restoration. That's still up in the air. All that has to happen is for the comptroller, and he's willing to sign it, the mayor and the governor to sign, and those funds can be dedicated to NYCHA. But that may mean moving a lot of people, including some members of our city council. Roughly, that all doesn't add up to the $16 billion needed to put NYCHA into decent condition and assuage residents' anger at the authority for having to live under the conditions they are. If the necessary resource is not available, NYCHA will have the task of managing decline over the next decade, as Councilmember Richie Torres puts it. Crumbling developments will be at increasing risk of loss. The options are few to prevent this. Capital generation from infill development is one strategy that NYCHA can control. RAD conversion is literally the only other federal straw that authorities can grab at. So I would say that the next generation plan, whether we like it or not, may be a much needed dose of reality. Thank you.
All right, thank you for starting us off, Vic. We're going to hear from Mo next. Monique Mo George joined Community Voices Heard as the Public Housing Campaign Director in 2009, and in 2014 became the organization's New York City Director of Organizing, working to advance Community Voices Heard's New York City chapter, as well as expanding its public housing campaign work. She has also worked as an organizer for the New York Public Interest Research Group, SEIU Local 1199, and the Empire Pride Agenda. So let's welcome Mo. Thank you.
You're awesome. Right now? Hello? Nobody can hear it. I can project now. I'm an organizer. I was just trying to be nice using this mic. I don't need it. But I see they're recording, so I'll let them fiddle faddle with it while I talk to y'all. So I don't have a nice shiny presentation like Vic, but I will respond to some of the next generation questions. And first, let me start about giving you a little background about CVH and specifically our public housing campaign. So CVH, folks don't know, we turned 20 on Monday. Well, something about that. Well, we celebrated on Monday. And we are a organization made of low-income folks predominantly women and folks of color who are working on issues that directly affect them, right? And those issues include welfare and workforce issues. We are the lead organization that just ended the WEP program, Give It Up For Us, which is the work experience program, which is, if you don't know, research it. It is nothing but modern day slavery. It's a long fight. My colleague is here who was like one of the, really organizers on ending that. It is finally done. We couldn't be more excited about it. And we also do public housing, work in public housing. The public housing campaign is actually 10 years old, and it was started by the women who were working on public assistance who realized that they also lived in public housing and that there were a lot of issues within public housing that they wanted to work on. So they founded the public housing campaign. Our membership is New York City wide. CVH itself is statewide. We have chapters in New York, Westchester County, Dutchess, and Orange. And but the New York City campaign is like I said, is New York City wide. So our members of the campaign come from all various developments throughout the city, including Staten Island. So, and then we also work on participatory budgeting, which we hear is fastly being looked at as a pilot to be developed into a pilot project for NYCHA. And originally, we were the lead community group that brought PB here to New York City. And it has grown in leaps and bounds. We're now up to 27 council members across the city who are adding up to between to $1.15 million of their budget for the actual residents to decide how it goes. So if you have PB in your district, you don't know about it, get in. It's an amazing process. And originally we brought it here to New York City to actually be done at the Housing Authority because the Toronto Housing Authority residents of there had done participatory budgeting, and residents found it a really great way to actually get projects done within the Housing Authority and have more say. So we're excited that there's possibly be a pilot program to do it here in New York. Residents of housing authorities here need as much stay in their housing as possible. So in regards to NextGen, what I'll say is, so in past, and I'll try not to repeat too much of what Vic said, in the past when the plan was called Infill at the time. I don't know what they call it now. Affordable housing. Yeah, it's grown. So at the time it was Infill when it was introduced by the Bloomberg administration. We did a lot of organizing with Douglas houses, which is on the Upper West Side, and we have a lot of members in Douglas against Infill at the time. And the being against Infill wasn't against housing, because residents are clear that housing is needed in this city. They are clear that this city has become the have and have-nots, and that 60,000 people sleep in homeless shelters every night, and they need some place to go. But what they were not in favor of was the fact that you were going to, at that time, put luxury buildings on green space. And the reason why, NYCHA is the way it is and spaced out the way it is and has the amount of green space it was to allow for people to not continue to live, right up under each other. And they, certainly were not in favor of looking at a shiny new building that they had absolutely no chance of getting into, while their buildings continue to deteriorate. So we did a lot of, organizing work with Douglas and with those residents there, and, with groups around the tables. When Damaris comes here, she'll talk about more. because down the Lower East Side, there was a lot of developments. I think at that time, maybe about 5, there was a proposal for maybe about 5 developments down there, and they were really leading the action around infill. And since we had a development on our side at that time, we were, doing joint actions together all across the city. It was some really amazing work. So when we heard that the administration at that time decided to not continue infill, it was a clear win at that time. And then we also CBH hosted a sleepover of all the mayoral candidates at the time, including our current mayor, and we asked them about infill. We said, this is not a good process. Are you going to do it? And we heard from every last one of them, that they were not going to do it. So imagine our surprise when our current elected official decides to do not infill, but affordable housing, clothed in infill. And, and so now we have to say to him, like, we asked you about this. And, and what we got was like, well, now it's not the same thing. Well, actually, yes, it is. You can pretty it up, but yes, it is. Even the 100% affordable is not going to be affordable for folks in public housing. So presently, when we talk about what we've done currently with this new form of affordable housing is CBH organized in Millbrook houses. Millbrook has 1,134 units in it. We knocked on every door in Millbrook. All 1,134. We got over 800 people to come out to meetings, to the actual visioning sessions that NYCHA held, and residents voiced their opinion. And I'll have to say, in the very beginning of the process, residents, which was wrong, residents were not aware that they were coming to those visioning sessions to decide whether a building was going up into development. At the time, NYCHA did not tell residents that was why they were there. They were thinking that at the time, NYCHA had applied for another program called Choice Neighborhood Initiatives that encompassed their area of Mount Haven, and they were told that those visioning sessions would inform Choice Neighborhood, which it probably did, but we later found out really it informed this affordable housing plan. And in the end, they were asked, like, if something was going to go up, what would you like? And they said, well, we would like senior housing. And then, then next thing we know, the 3 developments that had the infill, had the visioning sessions, Millbrook, Ingersoll, and Van Dyke, were all getting some various form of affordable housing. So on the one side, there was a win because at least they're getting senior housing, but that's not really a win because the senior housing income that they're talking about is still 48. And you know what I mean? It's still 48. I think it's like 48 for a family, 46 for a family of 3. And that's supposed to be 100% affordable for seniors, right? So, so given that, we were like, okay, that still doesn't, that still doesn't sound right, and that's not 100% affordable. And since then, what we learned, we took what we learned from Millbrook to say, you know what, this obviously is the path. It's clear that it is the path that NYCHA is going towards, and we need to speak to some folks to see how we can get to deeper affordability. We've held Vic, myself, some other folks, we've gone to the Housing Preservation Department, HPD, because NYCHA and HPD are actually partners in this long-term 10-year affordable housing plan. And we said to them, well, the term sheets that you're using, HPD is the one who creates the term sheets for affordability and all this other thing in housing, actually does not suit the population where you're trying to put these buildings. And, after this meeting, they said, well, you can give us something and we'll look at it. So we're going to do more than that. We're going to give them something that they're going to do. Because the best part about the campaign and about the members of public housing that I work with is that they realize that the power lies in them. And that organized power beats financial power, beats the will of any administration in the city. And so they have learned from Millbrook, and now Holmes, which is also in the area where we serve, our offices in East Harlem, Holmes residents have come out verbally to say which is up on the Upper East Side, and there is a building being proposed there in a space that would be directly in front of another public housing building, so you would, be able to see just as clear as you can see into there. And it would take away, they would lose a playground and then partial parking, which parking in this city is ridiculous and expensive. And, and even in that area, if they were to go into a private parking lot, it would cost them over $500 a month. So the residents there said, no, we can't afford a building here. And they have started to rally against and come together and organize themselves to say no actively, envisioning sessions that are coming up that Vic talked about on the 7th, I think it is, something like that. And, they've decided that that's not the way to go, that the funds to preserve NYCHA should not be raised on the back of NYCHA residents. And that's what, this the past administration and this current administration is telling residents. And residents are saying, no, this city should have a commitment to public housing. It is disgusting that this city has given more in the past to Yankee and to Citi Field than it has given to public housing. And trust me, I'm a fan of both of them, born in the Bronx. So this is no diss to the actual teams, but it is disgusting that we have, people living in beyond deplorable conditions, previously waiting as much as a year and change for repairs. Nobody outside of NYCHA has to do that in private housing. You can't go to your super and say, oh, I have a toilet leak, and he tell you, okay, I'll be back in 2017. And then you go, okay. You be like, yeah, okay. You know what I mean? But that's the reality for public housing residents every day. And it has been their reality and continues to be their reality. So our organizing efforts is around that. It is around making sure that their voices is heard. Public housing in this city is sort of the size of Boston. And, it is sort of the sleeping giant that is, quietly waking up. We took 600 people up to New York, up to Albany last year to rally for money for the state. Oh, this year, Jesus Christ. It feels so long ago. This year, actually. And, they were able to what was $25 million. Originally was $25 million from the state, got increased to $100 million. Right? Even though we don't know where the $100 million is, that's another story. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But still, it was because of their efforts that it got raised. And I think what they realized in that is that they do have power, and that they will be exercising that power. And as you see me, myself, and my colleagues around this table in the continuing months, and folks in the audience, I see Cav here and some other folks that we work with, you will see the rise of the sleeping giant because, like I stated, in the beginning, this is the city, has become the city of the have and the have-nots, and the have-nots have decided they will not take it anymore. And whether it is via meetings with NYCHA or in the street, their voices will be heard.
Thank you very much, Mo. We're going to hear now from Michael Higgins Jr. He is a member turned organizer at Fury, Families United for Racial and Economic Equality. A native of Fort Greene, Michael works with public housing residents in developments around downtown Brooklyn, building power in low-income communities around issues of accountable development, environmental justice, and municipal governance. Michael?
Okay. It's hard to follow Mo, but I'll try. So the way I organize my notes for this is that I try to really get the heart of what this panel was supposed to be about, and what that was, what does the next generation of NYCHA look like, right? So I basically organized it in 4 big points that I'll go over, and I'll try to be relatively brief, right? So the first point I have is the rise of land prices next to NYCHA developments. So the development that I'm most, familiar with is Ingersoll Houses, which was just one of the first 3 to engage in the NextGen NYCHA process. And within the last 10 years, so just a little brief little intro. So Ingersoll is right next to downtown Brooklyn. It's right on the other side of Flatbush Avenue from Metrotech. And so in 2005, a large, I would say maybe 3 or 4 blocks along Myrtle Avenue was rezoned, right? And basically overnight, what was, basically 1-2-story commercial storefronts became, basically millions of dollars to potentially build. And so in the last 10 years, 3,000 new units of high-income housing have been built within 1.5 blocks of Ingersoll. And, I estimated it, using, the city's, ACRA system. But I estimated that the real estate assets that have been built or are being built would be worth somewhere in the range of $200 to $250 million. Right? So in addition to that, we also do a lot of our organizing in Wyckoff Gardens, which is experiencing the NextGen Neighborhoods process right now. It's being targeted for a 50-50 affordable market split. And so that would put, if you're looking at market rates, that would put a studio at about, what, $2,500 a month, right? And yeah. So right now, Wyckoff Gardens is 3 buildings, each of them about 21 stories, and there are about 527 units currently, along the grounds, and they are proposing another 550 to 650 within the process. So it will be 2 additional buildings, and they would be built on 2 current parking lots. So just like how Mo says, there's this language of often underutilization, and that is very central to the infill proposal. And I call it infill because it doesn't feel much different from the proposal Bloomberg had. In addition, another development that we do work in, Farragut, has been the center of the recent rezoning of PS 307 and PS 8, if you guys have been reading it in the New York Times. And so, historically, Farragut has kind of been really isolated. It's in, a weird corner of Brooklyn. And, over the last 10 years, it's found itself right next to Dumbo, right? And, there are serious fears that a lot of, the residents, the parents who send their kids to school have about, one, just the idea of having a class of families and their children that are so much more wealthier than you, and maintaining, I guess, the level of respect and accountability of teachers and leadership, right? And, not to mention the questions about, Title I funding and just, federal funds that are very much tied to poverty statistics that, a lot of these families are reliant on, right? So that's my first point. My second point is the large increase of groups that have historically not resided in public housing that are often in need of translation services. So I live right across the street from Ingersoll houses. I live down the block from Farragut houses. And I live across the street from Whitman houses. When I was younger, the amount of Asian residents that I saw, I could count on 2 hands. And they are now a very visible part of the population, and NYCHA just isn't ready for their presence in terms of just the amount of translation services, and really, it's like, I don't want to say assimilate, but really acculturating them to what is NYCHA, just how NYCHA does things, right? So I do see my CAB folks in the audience, and I know you guys just released a report a couple weeks ago that I would like to talk about. So just some stats. I won't be too long-winded. Long story short, NYCHA lacks the organizational capacity to serve this new population, right? Especially, low proficiency speakers who don't speak Spanish. So, one of the big, light bulb, ideas that came out of the report is that there are only 6 people dedicated to language access and translation services for all of NYCHA. 600,000 people, right? And of those 6 people, only 2 of them speak an Asian language, right? So, not only do Asian residents often, they can't receive translation, as in they go for a spoken translation or a written translation of something that they've received and they can't get it. NYCHA really doesn't even have a system to really categorize the different languages that are now being spoken in their developments. So, you would think that there would be some sort of census, some sort of regular process to just make sure we know who lives in our buildings, we know what services they need. NYCHA doesn't have that, right? And that's not, it's not just, people in the management office. NYCHA has its own customer service hotline. And, if you call it, it's 1 for English, 2 for Spanish, 3 if you speak something else. But, of course, people have to actually know English to know that that's what's being said to them, right? Right? So, and, of course, there is no feedback for the very little translation services, however possible that these folks do receive. There is no, I guess, way for them to critique it, to say, I needed this, you provided that, this is how this could be better, this is how that could be better, right? My third point, there is a increasing demand for senior housing, and that's based on just basic demographics. So you hear the stat that 10,000 Americans turn 65 every day, and they will be turning 65 every day for the next 15 years, right? So if I were to extrapolate that down to New York City, that would be 250 people, if I did my math correct. And so you're having a large demand for affordable housing with people who are having a reduced income, because obviously they're retiring, right? So for its credit, NYCHA does have some services it provides to seniors. It has 12 developments that are currently listed as naturally occurring retirement communities that do provide social and medical assistance to seniors, 60 and up. It also has an elderly safe at home program where I guess it deals with the the perennial concerns about safety, and it actually provides workshops around crime prevention and other services around benefits and entitlements. There are also 120 different senior centers that are on NYCHA developments. Of course, NYCHA doesn't want to be in the community center, senior center business anymore, and so there's a question about who gets those senior centers then, and who provides services. Because obviously, if you go to a TA meeting, you're looking at a bunch of folks at least 55 and up, right? And last but not least, public housing residents find themselves in areas susceptible to climate events. And obviously, we are preparing for a hurricane. A lot of public housing find themselves very susceptible to flooding, whether that they're in Red Hook, the Rockaways, the Lower East Side, or Coney Island. And NYCHA has recently received $3 billion from FEMA in order to make repairs to developments that have been affected by the storm. But to me, it's not enough to just simply bring NYCHA back to where it was, because where it wasn't really a good place to begin with. And so one of our campaigns, in addition with a few other organizations, is to really bring in the language of climate resiliency and really emergency preparedness to residents, just so we know these storms are going to happen, and it's best to actually have a plan for God knows when it does happen. So
You want NYCHA to have a plan?
we can try.
You want too much, Michael.
We could try, and of course that's it's an issue of bureaucracy, but at the end of the day, to me, it's an issue of just political will and money, right? And so we want public housing to be a safe and healthy place to live, and we want it to also be able to survive what's going to happen to it in the future. And I think that's basically it.
Thank you very much, Michael. Is Damaris in the room? No, she's not here. All right, so hopefully she's going to come, and if she does, we'll carve out a space for her to speak and add the voice from the Lower East Side. But we're going to open it up to questions. I have a ton of them, but I'm only going to ask one, and then I'm going to take questions from the audience. So the question I want to start with is about the form of reaction or resistance. We heard a little bit about what each of your organization is doing, but is there a campaign? Are there multiple campaigns? Is there a coalition? Are there multiple coalitions? What has the response or the resistance been?
You mean pertaining to Next Generation, against Next Generation?
I'll say
NYCHA,
yes
or,
and.
Oh, okay. So yeah, there's a bunch of coalitions. We are coalition full. There is the one that Vic chairs, which is the Alliance, the New York City Housing Alliance, that has organizations that do work in public housing plus elected official. It's a really powerful space that's always very well attended by elected officials' office and stakeholders in public housing, and does amazing work around putting forth policies and presenting papers and doing briefings around to really let, and I'm going to say it because Vic won't, but really to let elected officials know what's going on in their district, because some of them, not so much, what's going on, and really to get them to move on some of the issues that affect NYCHA, and not just their district, but NYCHA-wide. So there's that. There's coalitions that we all sit on called the Real Affordability for All Public Housing Committee, which is a newer coalition, not as old as the Alliance. It's probably, I don't know, maybe 2 years now, I think. Maybe 2 years. Well, the actual committee is 1 year, but Real Affordability for All is 2 years old. And it is, the Public Housing Committee is made up of 12 groups around the city that are doing work in public housing. And there's another coalition that's forming around a policy called permanent exclusion I can talk about later. So all of these coalitions are built up to push back against some form or all forms of policies that really are not in favor of residents, right? And so, but when we, when I say CVH, Cav, who's in the audience, Damaris, Goals, Fury, Vic, Legal Aid, Urban Justice, when we all, come together, we come together to mostly to talk as a united front. We try to stay as a united front as much as possible and support each other, because we all have the same goal. We all want to save, preserve, and improve public housing. So
it's a little like an interlocking board of directors.
Yep.
We're
Yep.
involved in all of these.
Exactly. And it's very rarely that one of us is doing something in sort of a silo, right? That's very rare. I mean, we may be doing a campaign, locally in a development that is in our district, but I would say 80% of the time we're doing things as a collective, because we know that we're stronger together. We are clear, right? And as Michael said, there are 600,000 folks in public housing, and the only way that we're going to shift policies, such as pushing back against, non-affordable housing, is for us to collectively do it together. So there's not just one campaign. There are a lot of coalitions that have gathered to attack, various parts of this, large mountain. So, so I'd like to tell people we're taking down a mountain, but unfortunately right now we got a little hammer. And no, I should say we got a jackhammer now. We've moved up to a jackhammer now, because before we actually had a little hammer. So, hopefully we're going to have some, we'll get some equipment to really take down the mountain, but it's a slow pace with NYCHA.
Let me just add that the coalition serves several important functions. First of all is information sharing. It's very difficult to develop a kind of common perspective on what's happening at NYCHA. Dealing with its press releases, it's a mammoth of a bureaucracy, does a million things at one time. So it's a place where information is shared, some of it inside information. It's also a place where strategy is discussed and planned, and on the best occasions, when there's an overriding consensus on position and strategy. And that occurs a good deal of the time, not always.
Okay. Well, like I said, I have a lot of questions, but I want to open it up. I was going to take a bunch of questions, but with a room like this, I think we can take them one at a time at first, and then maybe take a group. Karen?
First of all, I want to thank all of you for being the lions at the gate. I was a little bit scared when I saw this plan come out, and I said, oh God, they're going to give de Blasio a pass. So thank you, and you're doing it phenomenal.
No pass, no passes.
No pass it on, as we used to say in the old days. But when I looked at the plan, and by the way, I was involved, as you know, in stopping the infill plan
Right.
I'm with the Urban Justice Center Safety Net Project as an advisor to them still. And what I saw that I was most concerned about is that we are all concerned about the repairs. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
My name is
press the
Karen
button.
Smith.
Press the button, so it's green.
My name's Karen Smith. Hello, whatever. We're all concerned about the state of repairs or lack of repairs, and we know it has to change. People are dying. And we have to think probably how to do that, where that's going to come from, because we know the federal government's cutting it out, and this is an excuse to get rid of public housing. But it's not working.
Yeah, it is working.
Hello, it is? Okay. My major concern from what I saw in the plan is I haven't seen statistics to show that the money that they say they're going to raise as a result of this plan will pay both for the upkeep of NYCHA and the repair, plus the new places. I haven't seen enough to show me that. And one of the things I think we need to demand is that they give us all of that stuff, Vic, you may have, to show so that we can have our own forensics look at it. That's my first concern.
Right.
Second concern is that we know there's been hundreds of thousands of dollars that NYCHA has had to make repairs in the past, and we don't know where that money's gone or why. Because NYCHA's, I don't want to say corrupt, but let's just say they're less than competent. And so if they're incompetent, they're going to be the ones to manage this where they've proven already that they can't do it. That's another concern of mine. And the last concern I have is what they're calling, what's it called, discussion. What's the word?
Visioning,
That they're required to meet with the TAs.
resident engagement.
Resident engagement. I spoke recently to somebody. I was concerned about the outlying boroughs because Manhattan's been pretty strong. But even I'm hearing from the Lower East Side, some of the TA presidents are meeting and saying, well, if we can get this, because it's coming, we will give it up. I heard from people in Wyckoff that they really haven't been, they're meeting with the TA president, but not with the TA. That's not resident engagement. So all of this is going on, and I just think, we should call it what you called it, Mr. Higgins. I don't know you, so I won't call you Michael yet. We should call this Infill 2. This is not affordable housing. This is Infill 2. It's a little bit better because they're at least talking the language of 50-50, but it's not, the income bands are not affordable, as you point out, Mo, for the people there. And I think that the whole thing is a ruse. So anyway.
Yes. All right, let's take responses while Damaris is coming up. The questions were about, data transparency, NYCHA competency, and then sort of truth in rhetoric.
Well, I think the question of transparency is key to some of Karen's questions about what NYCHA will do with more money if more money is generated. And that's a question we get asked when we go to Albany or to City Hall to ask for the capital. I think the approach I take is that you can't get your roof fixed without money in the bank. You might have to go a number of steps to get it done right, but you got to have the money in the bank. So the capital's essential. NYCHA hasn't worked out a step-by-step plan for how it's going to take on and use the money it generates. That's a level of management that is far beyond the plan. So I think the repairs issue is critical. That's what makes residents furious with the housing authority. That's partly why NYCHA collects only 75% of the rents. And clearly internal reforms are needed. And we're trying to take a look at that, particularly around how NYCHA manages its housing and so on. I can go into details on that. but it needs a thorough looking at. Otherwise, we're dealing with a public housing program that runs the risk of being considered incompetent, which means it's going to get even less than it needs.
Does anybody else want to respond to the questions? I suppose. All right. Let's thank you so much, Damaris, for coming. I understand you're not feeling well. It's okay. Thank you for being here. I'm going to introduce you, and maybe you can say a few words about goals on the Lower East Side, NYCHA? Okay. So Damaris Reyes is Executive Director of Goals, which stands for Good Old Lower East Side. She is a lifelong resident of the Lower East Side and has been with the organization since 2000. She has been involved in community organizing and housing issues both locally and nationally for nearly 20 years, and is also a member of Community Board 3 in Manhattan, where she sits on the first ever Public Housing Committee, its Land Use, Zoning, and Housing Committee, and its Waterfront Task Force. So thank you again for being here, Damaris.
Thank you for having me. I do apologize for being late. I was ill and I was stuck in a cab for over an hour. I forget how New York is. I'm with Goals, and I've been with Goals since 2000. But Goals has been around for about 38 years, and we work on largely tenant rights issues, housing preservation. The major issues that we cover today are housing and public housing, rent-regulated housing. We work on land use issues. We also work on climate preparedness issues and economic equality issues. We do our work using a multi-pronged approach of direct services, community organizing, public education, research, and coalition building. And I've had the honor of working with some of the folks on this panel for a really, really long time on the great fight to save public housing in New York City. Do you want me to, is that good?
Mo mentioned that you had called the previous Infill. So maybe if you could talk about what happened there and how you see this plan in relation to that.
Wow, so that was a nightmare, literally. We had just come off of dealing with Superstorm Sandy when the news broke in the Daily News. And a lot of residents of the neighborhood were really concerned, really upset, and not really understanding where this was all coming from in terms of the privatization of what they saw as as public land. In our neighborhood, there were 5 developments that were going to be a part of NYCHA's initial infill plan. Out of the 8 that they have proposed for Manhattan, 3 were uptown in Harlem, and 5 were on the Lower East Side. One of them happened to be the development that I actually live in. So you can imagine that we got quite an earful from folks about it. Part of the problem with the initial plan is that NYCHA was proposing 80% market rate housing, 20% affordable, and all of this was happening without any conversation. In fact, they talked a lot about how they went around and had presentations, but that's really all they were. They were presentations to the public about what they were planning, and the kind of input that they were soliciting were very basic things like, where would you like to see this bench, for example. So there really wasn't any room for residents to have real input and to determine what their communities would look like or how any of this money would be used, or even if, their development was the right site for infill. So people were really upset. We worked a lot with residents from Smith Houses who were extremely concerned, for a number of issues. They tend to have a lot of gas pipe issues, so any kind of construction over there really scares them, and it puts them in a place where they think about like other environmental hazards. So they were very, very active in that campaign and very, very vocal with NYCHA. We did everything working together. It wasn't just goals, but some people that are in this room, Karen, Mo's team at CVH, folks from Cooper Square. It was a collective effort because these issues, we can't address them all by ourselves, right? We're not, they're bigger than any one of us, and it's gonna take, all of us united to really get, at them. So, we did a bunch of stuff. We had walkouts, we had boycotts for their meetings. We hung banners all around the city asking the Bloomberg administration to, step aside and let the de Blasio administration decide, which apparently they did.
That was bad.
And, we tried to talk to, we filed a lawsuit against them. We even took them to court for repair issues because one of the other issues was, and why Smith Houses was also very active, they had a lot of repair issues. And when they tried to talk to the housing authority about their repair issues, they were essentially told, well, this is why you need infill. So let's talk about what you need. And they felt like they were being held hostage. So we had to launch what we call a group action, an HP action, and it was one of the largest in the history of the city with over 350 different plaintiffs taking NYCHA to court for one development. Very successful, but in any event, these are some of the things that we wound up doing to try to beat this, and ultimately we dropped the lawsuit because NYCHA did not move forward, but here we are today with NextGen. So, I'll stop there.
The only question I'd ask is how you see NextGen in relation to that fight. Is it the same thing? Is it better? Is it worse?
So it's clearly not exactly the same thing. If we said it was exactly the same thing, then we would be misrepresenting. I think how they intend to use, how they intend to raise revenue is the same by leasing the land and building market rate housing, but it's not the same amount. There's much more affordable and senior housing. So that I think we like, right? We'd like that there's 100%, affordable senior housing. We need senior housing. We know that in this city, in the next decade or so, the senior population will have reached 20% of the population. So, I think we're supportive of that. We're not supportive of the market rate housing. Most people are not really supportive of the market rate housing. So is it exactly the same? No, it's not exactly the same. Are there some things that are better? Absolutely. But I'll tell you what is the same, that though they are engaging in conversations and doing visioning, in these developments, for example, they are still set in what the percentage of housing is. So there's no conversation about that. It's not like they're going to the development and they're saying, okay, let's talk about what we could possibly build here and what that income breakdown could be like, or what the mix of housing, market rate housing versus affordable versus senior housing. No, they're choosing high priced value developments, land, where the land is high value, and they're going over there and they're saying, it's 50-50, now let's talk about everything else. And I can tell you that we've received calls